what we are going to do now is we are going to move over to the caseware file. And you will see at the very top, it is the same file that I used in the previous sessions as well. So it's still wrap-up manufacturing, level 2, and that D stands for delegate file. So it's the same file that I put on the success community for you to download. If you want to follow along today, you are welcome to follow along. If you want to rather see what I do, where I go, and then go and look at it in your own time, you're welcome to do that as well. You've got the file, and so you can refer to it again and again at a later stage. What I want to remind you also is that this file is on the latest template. So if perhaps you are opening it later on and you see it doesn't look the same as yours, if I maybe just go to the first document that we're going to look at, which is 1120, right at the top here, you can see the version number 2024.20.23. So the 2024 is that we released this template last year in 2024. The 20 is telling you it's a probe document, and then 23 tells you it's the second release from 2024. So there was a release in June, July last year, I think closer to July, and there was a release in November last year. So we created the working paper, this engagement file for the training on the most recently available template, which was the November 2024 version. Shouldn't have an impact on our general planning, but just in case you start preparing your working papers and you see there's maybe something different, that might be the reason. All right, so we started the theory part this morning and we said we need to understand the entity. And in the left-hand side here, if I just move the little map for you slightly, we spoke about understanding the entity and the environment. And we mentioned things like structure and ownership, business model. We mentioned the financial reporting framework and the policies, all those red scrolls that were on our slide. Those are the elements that we need to understand of the client in order for us to complete 1120, the inherent risk assessment. As always, we start with documenting which risk assessment procedures we completed in completing this document. And remember, you don't always have to perform all 3 of them on every document, but somewhere along the line on all of your risk assessment procedures, you have to do somewhere. You've got to do inquiries, somewhere you've got to do observations, and somewhere do some inspections. Right. So whenever we have discussions with someone, remember again, the documentation requirement says you must say who, what their role is, and the date, so that next year, if you're looking for Andy Crack and he's maybe no longer there, then the next person will know, well, it was the accountant. So we can just go and speak to the accountant again, and also just to give some background to context to what that person's role was when they gave you the answers. Right. So I'm not going to read through every response that we've typed here. I rather wanted to give you this as an example of what can be completed and then highlight a few points for you here. The structure of the document is it's got some questions in the first column. It's got space for you to document a description in this middle column. And on the right-hand side, you can record a risk if you identify anything. Now, if there are inherent risks that we are identifying in all of the documents again, those inherent risks will be recorded here in 1120. Those are the financial statement level inherent risks, right? If we come across a fraud risk from any of the documents, they will be recorded in the 1125 document that we're going to look at next. And the control risks ones are also those indirect control risks or financial statement overall level risks. Any of the assertion level risks are, of course, recorded under the sections. You'll probably be familiar with that already. And then even if we almost want to say think towards the finalization stage already, not that we only record these in finalization stage, but if we also come across other events like going concern events or conditions, subsequent events, items to report to management, and sometimes there's even 1 or 2 other matters that we might want to record there in this record button. Right. So we did document here that all the shareholders are directors. Not all directors are involved in the day-to-day operations. There's no difference in the legal structure of the company and their operating structure. Single legal manufacturing entity, no investment in other entities, and the main shareholder is the Larry Attic Trust. Right. It's not just filling in information. Remember, we are trying to identify information so that we can understand our client, understand the environment, so that we can ultimately assess the inherent risk for the client. I'm going to just quickly jump through each of those sections. The business model, you've got some questions there. These green points, those are called considerations. You can also see it says consideration. And these are really just telling us some points that we could probably document below each of these questions. So it's not a requirement by the probe methodology. Some firms do say if there are 5 bullets, you need to document 5 things on the right-hand side. Others say just document the relevance. So there's no specific prescription from the probe documentation or methodology side. But the considerations are definitely giving you additional information. There's also, I want to almost say, more consider points when you have chosen extended, just because we also incorporate the application material and other guidance. In terms of industry regulatory factors, those are there. Measures to assess the financial performance, and then the financial reporting framework and policies. And there, some information is already pulling through from documents that may have been completed earlier on. We didn't record any risks in this case. So as long as there are no risks, the documents basically follow the process of the highest risk that you record will be the risk that will be basically assessed as. So if you do have risks recorded in this risk block in the inherent risk assessment document, then anything that's a risk higher than low there will automatically flow through to your, let's call it, overall assessment of risk, inherent risk at financial statement level. So your overall conclusion then. If you haven't recorded any risks, you only have the option to document low, right? So you don't then have the option to assess the risk at medium or high in any case. Why? Well, because you haven't recorded any risks that indicate a medium or high risk. So if you do believe it should be that, or if you have identified risks, you will go and record them. How do we record risks? Let's just see quickly. I'm just going to click add risk, and that will then take me into the risk dialog. So the yellow line there at the top just tells me I am now in risk record mode. Please, I think I've said it before as well, don't lock down your file in risk record mode. If you can see the yellow line, then that means that you need to first go and click submit somewhere, and then you can lock down your file. I've had instances where firms have gotten really not nice findings from the inspections because you couldn't see anything in the file because, well, it was just in risk dialog mode, locked down in that dialog mode. All right. In terms of the source, where did you get the information to be able to identify this risk? We were in 1120 just now, so we will stay in 1120. And if I then double click, it will tell me where I came from. If I was in any of the other documents, it would actually show that to me as well. Okay. I can also type it in because I can see the gray block, which tells me it's an input cell. Then I will document my risk here. Right. Oh, goodness. I can't even type the basics today, it seems. I will then document my considerations. Now you'll see in the guidance document, which is like the little light bulb, to document the audit evidence that I use to assess the identified risk of material misstatement at the financial statement level. There's also some guidance there to say what is the effect that the risk could have, or the considerations that you used to identify this risk. So you'll document your considerations there and then conclude, is it a low, medium, or high risk? I want to show you what happens when I say medium risk here. So it's not a low, it's anything higher than low, will then prompt me to say these are the possible responses at financial statement overall level, how you can respond to these risks. So now you can choose to pick any of those. So we're going to maybe use more experienced staff or be more professionally skeptical, whatever it's going to be. You also have a point, an option for something else, another way to respond that you can then just click and document your other. Right. I'm going to click submit to record this risk, and that will then add a risk into our risk table for inherent risks as soon as the script has run through. That's my mesmerizing little blue circle. Right. In documenting my risk, you can then see that's what I've documented there. Now the risk of material misstatement is medium in my risk table. And at the same time, the overall conclusion is no longer a drop-down menu, but shows the highest assessed risk being medium. Good. So that's really the end there. In terms of conclusion questions, a question we get almost every single time says, risks that we would have expected management to identify but failed to do so. Have you, as part of this document, as part of completing this document and as part of your procedures, identified any risks that you would have wanted management to identify themselves as part of their risk assessment process? And if the answer is yes, that would be indicating that maybe management's risk assessment process is not working as we would have liked it to work. Thankfully, we can conclude and say, no, the risks that we did identify, we wouldn't have expected management to identify. So oftentimes these are almost maybe something like the risk of management override of controls. I wouldn't expect management to identify that they can commit their own fraud, I almost want to say. Or it could be more an audit type of risk, not so much a business type of risk, if that makes sense. So then you can say, no, even though I did identify a risk and management didn't necessarily do anything about it, that's more an audit risk and not so much a business risk. Then this question is also relevant then in terms of saying, do I want this overall risk assessment, medium in this case, to actually flow through or to also affect the risk of material misstatement at the assertion level? In other words, do I want this medium to also increase the risk of material misstatement of every single one of my risk assessments at assertion level? So for each assertion, for each of my account balances, right? You can decide basically to say, is my overall response in picking more experienced staff with specialized skills sufficient to address this risk? Or do I also basically need to audit more items as I go through each of the audit responses? If I say no, more experienced staff is sufficient, then I can conclude and say no, the risk assessment at assertion level does not need to be affected by this overall risk. Right, and then we've got some considerations just there. And my overall response, which is basically like a summary of all the various different options I could have picked, is then reflected in 1120 at the bottom. Okay, so if I had, let's say, 2 or 3 risks in my overall table at the top, I would have possibly had different types of responses for each of them, and those are then all summarized here at the bottom in my overall response. If we go back to the planning and risk assessment process, we've now completed then 1120 being the inherent risk assessment. I'm not going to look at the group documents today. So the next document in our group, in our list then, is the laws and regulations. So let's have a look at laws and regulations. So laws and regulations, when you open this document first, it will not show you this part. It's basically going to show you the list of laws and regulations that you need to select. So if you see basically a lot of blue, it's black now also because I've already made selections. But if you see a lot of blue, that's basically what the default blank uncompleted document looks like. So once you've made your selections, you'll click submit, and this is what your file will look like now. Okay, let's just have a look at what do we do in that selection stage. So in selecting acts, I have a variety. There's about, if I remember correctly, about 30 acts, which are mostly the most common acts in the South African environment. Okay, definitely not all of them. I remember years ago, someone, the person that did the research of which acts we could include here, oh my word, I don't want to lie now, but if I remember correctly, I think it was 230 different acts that the person identified back in the days to say these are all the possible acts that a business may need to comply with. So obviously we couldn't let you work through all 230 of those acts every single time. So we've included the most commonly used ones, which does mean that you may have to be alert to some other acts that is not listed here for any of your clients with maybe a bit more of a different type of industry. Okay, how do we go about this? For every one of these acts, I need to just make sure what my selection would have to be. The nice thing is that the default says it's not relevant. For example, if you have wrap-up manufacturing like we do today, that business does not have to comply with the Auditing Profession Act, so that act is simply just not relevant. Okay. The other options that we have is to say it is relevant, but there will be an immaterial effect on the financial statements. And that's like what we've picked here for the Basic Conditions of Employment Act and the Skills Development Levy and the UIF and those ones, saying they are in the purple block, but we don't have to zoom into them for the yellow block like we do for the Companies Act. For the Companies Act, we had picked direct material effect of financial statements. So in other words, we have to zoom in, we have to test compliance to make sure the client is compliant. Another one is the Occupational Health and Safety Act. That's the last option that we put to say it is in the yellow block, but it's on the right-hand side, possibly affecting fundamental operations of the business, trying to avoid material penalties, or possibly affecting the going concern of the business. So those ones still in the yellow block, and we're going to have to go and do a bit more work for them. So you'll go through that for each of them. If you want to add an act, you simply right-click, select Insert Row, which will add a row right at the end of the table, which you can then complete and do the relevant selection. Once you've done all your selections, you click Submit, which will then give you the working paper. So first of all, we start with laws and regulations which the entity is subject to. And that will then basically be our purple block. So we've included acts like your Basic Conditions of Employment Act, where we are trying to avoid Basic Conditions of Employment Act, that will not have a material effect, but that is relevant. We've got the Direct Effect Companies Act, the Income Tax Act, we've got the VAT Act, and then we also have the possible material effect, the Occupational Health and Safety Act. The short description pulls through automatically from the template, but you can add to it. And then what you have to do is you have to go and ask the client how are they identifying. You have to go and ask the client how they are complying with the framework. How are they attempting to comply? And that is really part of your understanding, still within the purple block on our slide. If you need to refer to any working paper, that's there. If you identify any possible risk of material misstatement, you've got your risk icon to record risks. The next part, mine seems to be jumping today. The next part is where we then consider laws and regulations that have a material effect, the possible material effect. That is now in the yellow block, where we need to address the arrow going down to say, identify instances of non-compliance by inspecting correspondence with the relevant licensing or regulatory authorities to check whether you can identify any non-compliance. So you don't have to audit compliance, but you've got to be alert to any non-compliance, and do that at least by looking at relevant licensing authorities' correspondence. If you don't identify any non-compliance, you simply say none identified. That will sign off your working paper, and that's all you need to do. If you do identify non-compliance, well, that will then obviously kickstart your no-CLAR, your report to irregularities, all of those procedures. And then lastly, all of those acts and legislation, let me just scroll down to the bottom. All of those acts and legislation where you have a direct material impact, like your Companies Act, your Income Tax, your VAT Act, and if you have others, they all need to have procedures added to the work programs. So you just here have the reference to 1220 with a note at the bottom, or the instruction, if it's read, to say, on 1220, go and make sure that you select the appropriate laws and regulations, that you go and switch on a section for laws and regulations in the work programs. Having said that, the procedures in the Probe methodology for the South African Companies Act, the Income Tax Act, and the VAT Act, those ones will switch on automatically where you have a material class of transaction account balance or disclosure. So in other words, material, and therefore need to at least have selected an assertion, or where you have a relevant assertion. In other words, where you have recorded a risk for that item. Right, so they will switch on automatically the requirements, the procedures in there. It feels like there was something else I still needed to show or tell you here. Oh yes, let me go and show you what that will look like on 1220. 1220 is our audit plan and strategy. And for 1220, let's just pick cash and cash equivalents as an example, you will have the option here to switch on. When I click and say my audit considerations are that there are specific laws and regulations that may have a direct effect on the determination of the amounts and disclosures in this item, when I click that there, automatically there is a new section or heading in my work program that says now you will have to go and include specific work procedures in your work program of how to audit the compliance with the laws and regulations. Right. So on the left-hand side, I clicked and I said, yes, laws and regulations were relevant for the section. And it then tells me, go and review what is now in the work program, which is essentially a prompt. What you will see here, though, is that I have not recorded an inherent risk for cash and cash equivalents. Well, we've only, I think we only selected the assertion. Yeah, in this case, So what it's going to do is now to say, well, you need to go and actually record a risk because we don't know which procedures to switch on. For the VAT and procedures and for the Companies Act, they will switch on at the relevant work programs. But if you just have a general procedure, that will not switch on and you will have to go and record a risk for those. But the software will prompt you for that. Okay. So I'm going to just switch this off because this was just a random selection to show you what that looks like. If you don't select laws and regulations, like let's say cash, bank and cash, there's no specific requirements for wrap-up manufacturing to comply with laws and regulations, so that's fine. We don't need a specific audit consideration and therefore don't need a specific heading in the bank auditing work program. Right, so that's laws and regulations in terms of our three parts, how we treat it in the audit. If I go back to my if I go back to my document manager, planning and risk assessment procedures, we were busy with laws and regulations. So next up, we have the fraud risk assessment. And what did we learn today? We've got our fraud triangle. So in 1125, which is the next document, right at the top, again, to document my risk assessment procedures that we had. In this case, we performed all three of them. And then you can see the procedures that we are prompted to perform. Again, a prompt on the left-hand side, a yes, no, do you identify something there? And then a description space is grouped according to the three elements: incentives or pressures, and a variety of questions, opportunities, and rationalization or justification. Having then worked through those three categories, we will go and record risks in our risk table. And what we see here is that we already have one risk. I didn't go and record any other risks, but you can always just go and add a new risk. But what is this risk that we already have in here? This risk is the presumed fraud risk for management override of control. So Probe is already including everything from ISO 240 that we need in there, and even all the way through to the work programs, etc. But you have to make sure that your documentation makes sense and is amended or adjusted for your specific audit. So we have to go in here, right-click and select Edit Risk so that we can open up the the risk dialog and see that we've appropriately documented this. All right. Again, yellow line at the top tells me I'm in risk mode. That's where we want to be. So that's right. The risk description is really the generic one from the standard. So you can always go and either add to it or adjust it completely, but that's where it comes from. The ROM considerations is to a large degree kind of an explanation of why we've included this. So you're welcome to actually delete it completely and override it. Write your own story, or again, just add to it if you want to. Right. Then normally there would be no response in your risk of material misstatement assessment. So you would have to go and select this, and you either have low or high. Right, we've assessed it, we've concluded it's high, and then because it's a fraud risk, it's always a significant risk, and a significant risk requires specific audit responses. More so, the standard, you will remember from the slides also, but the standard requires very specific responses. So in fact, you cannot actually untick these blocks. You have a little pop-up there that says ISO 240 paragraph 29. The standard requires this response, you shall respond. Right. You could, however, go and say, well, I also want to switch on professional skepticism or experts or amend the nature timing, whatever it is that you may want to do. All right, and again, if I say amend the nature timing of substantive procedures, that will flow through to 1220, and I will go and tick on that element for the relevant work program. So as you see, these 5 blocks already ticked for the management override of controls response, because those are the standards responses. And in our other block, we also have a summary here of what else Probe is doing, even though it's not listed as a default or a pre-programmed one in our list of overall response. The responses further in the file is already pre-programmed. 1, gain an understanding of the controls around journal entries. So we're already doing that. From 1150, that's where we are doing it. Test the appropriateness of journal entries. That's done in the work programs, and specifically in 1610 as well, around the preparation of financial statements. And then based on your fraud risk assessment, consider if you have to test additional journals, taking into account material, significant, unusual year-end adjustments, entries, and other non-standard journal entries are already tested in each section. So these then being the significant responses. Also remember that something like estimates is already addressed in the work programs and in 1053, in the work programs, in 1053, where we are already inquiring about them, and where I have indicated that there are estimates, the work program will specifically address those when we have identified risks for them. Okay, so that will already be in there. I'm going to click the submit button so that we can see what it looks like then in the table itself. So remember that this first table of identified risks is basically a line for each of the risks that we've recorded with the responses. And this one, of course, has a lot because there are a lot of requirements that we need to include. And then right at the bottom of the document, we have the overall responses. So we can see our documentation in here. And then again, the considerations about the risk assessment process. Have you identified any risks that you would have expected management to identify, but they didn't? And then the decision to say, does this risk affect your assertion level risk of material misstatement? And we said no, the overall responses are sufficient. Then the highest level risk recorded is high in my table of risks. So my fraud risk is high. And my overall responses is then a summary of what I have already recorded in the top, with some links of where these are automatically already done because, well, Probe accommodates for those. If we then look at what needs to be done further, we consider the internal control, our house, our roof, and the bricks in our house. So those are in 1130. We also have 1150, which is the information system and the control activities. That is the direct control, so the last 2 blocks or bricks that we had in our house, which we'll look at next time in the last 2 sessions, where we go and consider at assertion level. But at an overall level, that is where we complete 1130. So if we look at 1130, there again the risk assessment procedures, just to remind you that those are there. We are asked about, again, to document who we interviewed, etc. Then the 3 main headings: control environment, risk assessment process, and monitoring. Given procedures, you have to describe the procedure. Remember, this is almost like describing what control the client has in place. Describe the procedure, and then the little bit that is added to this one that's not in the previous 2 documents that we looked at is to also explain how you verified your understanding of the process. So it's basically saying, how did you make sure that you understood correctly what the client has done? This is not a walkthrough as we have for the information system and the control activities, but it is more saying, how did you make sure that you understood correctly how this is designed, how this is done? Of course, also it could be that you're actually looking at a policy or something, how it's actually working. So it could also be like a implementation test or a walkthrough type of thing. But to call it a walkthrough or implementation test could almost be confusing, because that's not always the case that you need to do. Right. So again, your 3 headings: control environment, risk assessment process, monitoring process, and then you've got your identified risks. Again, have we identified risks which we expected management to identify but failed to do so? No, and our control risk is then low. Good. And that is the evaluation of the system of internal control. If I then go back to the risk assessment planning and risk assessment, 11, 50, and 60 is then the assertion level risks. So we're then going to move forward to the audit planning section, where we're going to have a look at some of the other documents. So manager planning checklist is really a checklist of making sure that we have met the objectives of the auditing standards that relate to the planning section, the risk assessment section. So it's a checklist to check that we did what we needed to in that perspective. The audit plan and strategy we will spend more time on when we look at the specific sections. Again, there's a group document, further work at component level. Internal audit, the use of internal audit, and also the use of another practitioner, 1226. These are additional documents where we just need to consider that we are complying with requirements whenever one of these individuals or groups are used. Right, so I didn't switch on internal audit, I didn't switch on practitioners, so we're not going to work through those now. But what I do want us to look at are the use of resources. Remember, we also discussed that in the theory, and we said we have to consider who are the users, who are what resources we need. We have to consider what resources we need and whether we have enough of those resources, and not just human resources. So if we then go to the documentation, just to show you, use of internal audit is completely closed off because we didn't select that as a relevant point. So that just says you don't have to complete it because you said the client doesn't have internal audit, or you're not going to rely on internal audit. Whereas with the use of resources, here we have a full-on document. And this is almost like a declaration at the first bit to say, let's list each of the team members here, and let's say what their roles are, their qualifications, and then we go to the industry experience. Now, industry experience in this case is to say wrap-up manufacturing is in a manufacturing industry. So we will document the number of years that the person has in the industry of manufacturing, the number of years experience for this audit, for this engagement, right? And then any comment that may be necessary, that person's name is reflected and they signed off. Interesting now that I see her name because I'm signed in as Larisha. So what should actually happen is I should actually only see my sign off button when I click with my name, right? So you'll see also when we get to the engagement partner parts, I shouldn't be able to sign off for the engagement partner because you need to log in under your own name. All right. Then some other considerations that were added with ISO 220 revised. With regards to technological resources, what are we going to use? Do we have them? Are they permitted? And then also the intellectual resources based on the nature and the circumstances of the engagement, whether we have what we need. Right. That then brings us through to the planning memorandum. Now, the planning memorandum, 1230, is basically the document that we use to communicate with our audit team members what it is that was discussed at the planning meeting. So whether you are attending the planning meeting and therefore have to take the minutes and document it in here, or whether you did not attend the planning meeting with the engagement partner and now need to read through this as a summary of what was discussed at the planning meeting, it is important that everybody engages with this planning memorandum. Unless, of course, you attended the meeting yourself in person and you weren't the lucky winner of having to document the minutes. But otherwise, most of the team members would probably engage here. All right, this is where a lot of the communication that the engagement partner has to have with the team is then documented. So it might look like a little bit of duplication, but remember that if you perform the planning, yes, this is going to be, I almost want to say, old news to you. Let's say the related party relationships that were filled in somewhere else. So you're going to say, of course, I filled them in. I know it is that. But if you've got another person in the team that didn't complete it, didn't review the work, this is possibly going to be new information for them. Right. So the communication then required to the team members. What you can also see here is the audit plan. This is possibly going to look familiar to you if you maybe had a look at or considered what we documented in 1220 earlier, to say where are we going to have required procedures, where do we maybe have control testing, etc. So those are really just a summary of risks and the audit strategy. Then some more planning meeting notes to be communicated, significant discussions, and then the engagement partner has a declaration where he or she will document that they have performed the procedures that they needed to as part of the planning and well, as part of the planning of the audit. Very specifically focused on the quality management policies and procedures. So it links both ISO 220 revised and ISQM to ensure compliance with those requirements. Maybe just something that looks a little bit different. The yes, no's are at the end. So whereas before we might have had the yes, no's in the second column and then the references right at the end, but you answer on the right-hand side and then document in between. And then what's also really nice in the firm template, you can actually have automatic links to documentation so that when the partner signs off, they don't have to go and physically include the links. Like here, for example, did you review the audit plan and strategy? We all know that's audit 1220. So the link is already in there. You don't have to go and select it from a drop down. Whereas if there's something else that maybe has a different working paper, those may need to be selected automatically. If we think about this question 61, did you consider the relevance, blah, 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 blah? What did you look at? If the partner then selects specific items, you include the link as well. The partner doesn't have to go use the drop down by himself again. Right, so that's just really to make that quite a lot easier. If there are firm mandatory conditions and stuff, they can be included. And then as you can see here, I'm not logged in as the partner. Let's say it's Paolo partner or whoever. Only Paolo partner can sign off. If it was me and I'm signing as Larisha Governor, if I really am the partner, then I can sign this off. But we all know now that I already signed off in the previous document as part of the engagement team. So obviously, I can't be an engagement team member and a partner. So we will select the partner's name here. Let's say in my case, Paolo partner, and he will have to come and log in and sign off. Right, so that was a quick run through of the documentation to show you exactly where this links to what we discussed in the first bit of the session, the theory that we worked through, but really just to show you where this is applied in the probe working papers and documents.